Hello and welcome to this Global Horizons podcast. This is the Delhi Policy Group and I'm Hemant Singh. At a time of disruptive change in the global order, DPG Podcasts will bring to you realist and relevant policy perspectives on key issues. We hope that you will enjoy this episode. Hello and welcome to this podcast. I'm Hemant Singh. The subject of this episode is geopolitics. At a time of transformational change and volatility in the international system, it is useful to remember that in a world of nation states, rivalry and competition among great powers is a permanent feature. Statecraft based on unilateralism, coercive power, and resort to war continues to persist. Multilateralism is not a natural condition of global geopolitics. International law-based order requires the sustained commitment of major powers to global institutions and normative order. The post-1945 world order still prevails, but is being undermined by the guardians and revisionists alike. In this realist world, sovereign nations have to take control over their own destiny. What matters most is national resilience and comprehensive power. India is in a good place, and its power of example will most likely grow. And with that, I turn to our guest, Ambassador Nalin Surie, Distinguished Fellow for Diplomacy, Delhi Policy Group. Nalin, welcome. And would you like to begin by saying something about how events have unfolded since the beginning of this year?
Thank you, Hemant, and it's a pleasure to be doing this first podcast for DPG. Unfortunately, there is not too much to cheer about, but the world entered this year with a mix of despair at the present state of play, as you highlighted, and danger at what lies ahead. International norms and institutions have been driven into the background at best. War or aggression or violation of territorial integrity by different means has become the norm. The hopes and expectations that had arisen with the Cold War ended in 1990-91 have, to my mind, been belied. This year could well prove to be instrumental in establishing fresh outlines of new global and regional power balances. Developments in major powers, however, have given rise to signals that policy coherence may not be forthcoming for quite some time. The biggest sufferer in this process, regrettably, would be the emerging economies of the global south, whose need for rules-based order, institutions, and systems is the greatest. The Trump 2.2 era is the talk of the town. It has dawned swiftly and on cue based on earlier pronouncements, both in respect of his proposed policies domestically and internationally. The clear intent, to my mind, by President Trump is to use tariffs as a weapon to achieve foreign, immigration, and economic policy objectives, and this is likely to further weaken the structure of international institutions already struggling to remain relevant. Pronouncements and policies announced by the Trump administration last month point towards a clear intent to reorder the transatlantic partnership that has been the bedrock of the US-led Western alliance since the end of the World War II. This is being superimposed on the damage already done to international institutions by Western actions in recent years, especially after Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. This change is being systematically manifest in the new US administration's dramatic change in approach to the war in Ukraine, to the detriment of the latter, and yet undefined benefits that may derive from the rapprochement with Russia. Mr. Rubio's, Secretary of State Rubio's comment today would suggest that the United States may be losing some of its patience with Russia. President Trump continued last month with his explicit and implicit actions, which led to anxiety, frustration, anger, and a relook and rethink on long-held alliances, arrangements, and institutions. Multipolarity is no longer a bad word, although I agree with you that the West would not want to accept it if they have a choice in the matter. Trust has been the major casualty and uncertainty, the dominant factor in planning for the future. This is true in the geopolitical, international economic, and global security spheres, and I think we will be discussing this more in detail with you. While the objective of the US, to my mind, continues to be to ensure that the US remains the most dominant power in the world, it would appear that the US is no longer willing anymore for it to shoulder the preponderant economic, security, trade, assistance, and normative responsibilities for this purpose. The rest of the world, this administration believes, needs to contribute more explicitly to restoring US domination, which has been undermined over the years. The Trump approach, in brief, appears to be to set out negotiating parameters on critical issues and then extract concessions. This may well be an approach that can work in short-term business scenarios, but is not necessarily credible in matters of international peace, security, trade, and development, where trust and credibility are critical minimal requirements. Allies and partners may well bend, as they seem to be doing at this point in time in the immediate term, but will at least hedge and at the same time search for credible and long-term alternative arrangements. And I think the beginnings of that have also begun to happen. So let me stop at that, and we can take this dialogue forward from there.
Thank you, Nalin. That was a very interesting beginning. I think you've already sort of foreshadowed what was going to be my very first question to you, and answered most of it. But let me ask you one more time. It's clear that President Donald Trump continues to dominate global headlines, and you have referred to some of the aspects of what this implies. But can you walk us through a little bit more on the impact of his explicit and implicit actions on geopolitical, economic, and security issues in the international space? And I presume, of course, that bulk of the repercussions of all this will fall on the global south and the developing and emerging countries.
They're already facing a lot of the repercussions, but you're right. I think, in all fairness to the current US administration, one has to recognize that this process of change in the West's approach to issues and the post-Cold War arrangements actually began much earlier than the Trump administration came into power, including Trump 1. I would go as far as back as to say that this process of change started with the global financial crisis. It was followed by the COVID crisis and what I call the assisted rise of China during these two episodes.
Yes, the West has played a major role in that
and
rise.
I think this is something which has to be recognized. And thereafter, the army of sanctions imposed on Russia after the war in Ukraine sharply accelerated that process. Because you look at the sanctions that have been imposed, they were in violation. Firstly, they were not UN sanctions, UN approved sanctions. They were sanctions imposed by a group of Western countries, accompanied by some of their closest allies, including in East Asia. The sanctions were of a nature that impacted the international financial order. We are basically saying that we are freezing the assets of the central bank of Russia held all over the world, and we will use those assets as we deem fit to assist Ukraine or otherwise. Take the world trading system, sanctions on exports and imports. These sanctions are not in conformity with WTO rules and regulations. And I think the list goes on and on and on. So I don't need to labor this point too much. What has happened with Trump 2.0, in my opinion, is that the fault lines have been deepened and widened. And Mr. Trump seems to be in a hurry to reorder the world according to his priorities. And as I said in my opening remarks, this is a very clear intent to reorder the transatlantic alliance or the partnerships, which have been the bedrock of the Western alliance system, and which is why the Europeans and the Japanese and the other allies are in such a dizzy, because nobody knows where they're headed. His tariff tsunami has also virtually now sounded the death knell of the WTO, according to me. The dispute mechanism was not really working. Now, if everybody is going to be working on the basis of bilateral arrangements on tariffs and non-tariff barriers, then I think where does that leave the WTO? I think these are serious issues, and the biggest sufferers in all this process are going to be the countries of the South. And the interesting thing is that what is happening in BRICS, for instance, the effort to have bilateral payment arrangements in own currencies, is preceded Trump 2.0. But I think they were part of a process of reacting to the changes which had begun much earlier, where other powers, particularly the Chinese, began to show that they needed a bigger share of the decision-making pie in international relations. Now, you asked the question of impact on geopolitical, economic, and security. I think we can go on all night about it.
Yes.
I'll try and limit this in a manner that we can actually try and see where we are going, and also raise questions for us to take forward and consider.
Yeah.
In the geopolitical sense, I think the fundamental question now is who is leading the West? Is US leadership of the West now a given? We're already hearing important European voices saying that we need to look for new leadership of the West. So I think this is a very important factor on what will happen and towards what will happen in Eurasia as we go forward. And as we both know, Eurasia impacts the whole world. Within this context, there are various partnerships, I think, which we need to watch very carefully, and which will have again a major impact on geopolitical changes and geopolitical relationships going forward. First, the relationship between Russia and China. So far, this alliance, built specifically as a no-holds-barred virtual alliance in February 2022, is holding to the extent that there are credible reports that the Chinese are assisting Russia in its war effort against Ukraine. And this has been now acknowledged openly by the Europeans at the European Council level in their pronouncements. And they have sort of warned the Chinese that if you are supporting Russia in wars which impact European security, there has to be a price to be paid. The next is the interesting triangle which could emerge and which analysts are talking about may ultimately end up dividing the world into three parts. One, the Russian axis, the Chinese axis, and the US axis. Remains to be seen which, if this happens, which will be the most important axis. And then, of course, the quadrilateral. US, Russia, the European Union, and China. And I would stop by saying that it is the other fundamental alliance between the United States and the European Union. All these are beginning to, so the existing ones are beginning to unravel. The new ones have not yet come into being, but there are analysts who argue that some relationships are more likely to emerge in the coming years than others. Irrespective, it's a huge challenge for countries like India. And I think for us that is very important to keep in mind. It also begs the question of, and I think we will discuss that later today, will the US interest in Indo-Pacific remain as strong as it has been in the past? My own view is it will, but we will discuss that when we encounter the issue. On the economic side, I've already referred to the main changes on the financial international monetary system, the trade arrangements. But I think it's more than that now. The entire technology equation has come into question. Part of globalization was globalization of technology flows. These have begun to stop. The process began a few years ago, but I think with the Biden administration and now Trump 2.0, the process has become quite rapid. Now the question is, to what extent can this technological interaction be restricted in a manner that Western security is not impacted negatively? It has again serious implications for India. Does it impact technology flows into India? For India, the biggest development multiplier is technology.
Right.
So we'll have to take it from there. Then of course there are the other issues of developing secure value addition chains, access to rare earths and minerals. I think these are issues which will get resolved once the new trade partnerships become clearer. And even this monopoly which China has on certain rare metals and earths, I think is not a monopoly, it can be sustained. It will require obviously a lead time for other users to build up their capacities to refine these and produce these minerals and rare earths into usable products. I think we have to see how that goes. So a lot of this, that's why I said, a lot of it is up in the air, and it's going to again, I come back to the point, it's developing countries like India which are going to have to pay, may have to pay a very high price, but I think so far we've done all right on that score. Finally, on the security issue, again, I think for the international community, including for us in the Indo-Pacific, the critical question is the future of NATO. And again, I think we will address this.
We will be, yes, we'll take it up.
But the two important developments I just want to point out in this context. One is, it is now at least clear to me that Europe has finally smelt the coffee. And they have realized that on security matters, either they get their own house in order, get their defense industry in order, get their armed forces in order, they will have be in a situation where they will not be able to defend themselves. So I think these new processes, including Rearm Europe, etc., which we have reported upon in our various reports, is something which is going to come up in a very big way. And I expect, I may be wrong, but I expect and I hope that the Europeans will now finally come of age and begin to act like a genuine pole in a multipolar world. And finally, and I think this is extremely important, the nuclear issue.
Mm-hmm. You think there are going to be more nuclear powers?
I suspect that the end result of all these major changes is that countries which are at the cusp of being able to develop nuclear weapons or have held themselves back for decades may now say that, the time has come for us to make sure that we can defend ourselves. I mean, Europe has two partners who have nuclear weapons, but I mean, there is no reason why countries like Germany cannot join those two countries. In the Far East, we both know Japan and Korea are literally a screwdriver away from acquiring nuclear weapons. And this has become even more pertinent in the context of the huge amount of resources being expended by China on building more nuclear weapons and their delivery systems. So let me stop at that. As I said, the last point I think which we need to bear in mind is the impact on the Indo-Pacific. And I think that from our perspective will be important when we discuss that.
We will discuss that indeed. So I do not wish to sort of summarize your remarks, Nalin, but I think you will agree that the Trump administration has turned out to be much more activist than people who thought that it was going to be turning inwards and going away. That's the first. The second is that there is a new type of American primacy which is on the horizon, and that includes a standalone supremacy in the Western Hemisphere and a standalone global primacy which is not directly linked to the liberal hegemony of the West. So some of those changes, and what you alluded to as far as the breakdown in the WTO relevance, I think it's important to note that going forward, whatever trading arrangements emerge between nations, issues of national economic security and national security will both be very important. Equally important will be the issue of countries trying to create overcapacities and deindustrialize other countries and gain mercantilist advantage over the rest of the globe. So I think let's move on then to the next question. All right, we come to Europe now and to the conflict in Europe. I think you know that President Trump has pressed Ukraine very hard towards the peace table. He's also engaging Russia. Outcomes remain entirely uncertain at this stage. Europe is struggling to find a balance between support for Ukraine and making room for dialogue with Russia, which arguably may be the only way of eventually restoring peace. How do you think this scenario will play out?
I'll give you a short answer. The long answer will take us all night.
All right, let's do that.
Look, the short answer to my way of thinking is a critical player here is the United States, not Europe.
Yes.
This is a process which has been driven by the US through NATO. And the Europeans have willingly participated for good reason, I think, in this case. But the Trump U-turn, as I mentioned in my earlier remarks also, has forced the Europeans to now take a relook at what is happening. Unfortunately for them, I think they've also realized that in any ceasefire or long-term arrangement, they may not be in the driving seat. They'll be lucky if they're in the room. So they are now busy preparing for a situation where they may have to defend a ceasefire or any peace agreement, even through perhaps the commitment of some kind of European peacekeeping force. But I think they believe, at least as of now, and I think that's the right requirement for them, there has to be a substantive US security guarantee that in case push comes to shove and things get really bad and messy, the United States will have to step in. Initially, I think the sounds coming out of American leadership was not very positive in this respect, but I think they are changing. I think one has to give credit to people like Secretary of State Rubio. I think he's trying to balance the ship.
Yes.
I think he's playing a very critical role in this process. He's being able to talk to all the allies, irrespective of what happens between them and Washington. He is trying to ensure that old systems remain in place. Importance of the G7 and other such arrangements is not diluted beyond a point, in the sense that if you need to restore them, that can be done very quickly. So I think that is important. But the Europeans will have to underpin any peace deal. And that is not only in military terms, but also in economic terms. Now here I think the situation becomes very difficult, because nobody knows what a peace deal will entail. Will it entail territorial concessions by Ukraine to Russia, which as of now are off the table as far as the Ukrainian leadership is concerned? And I think that extends to beyond Mr. Zelensky. Will they be forced to make territorial concessions? Will we have a new Minsk type of arrangement, which only puts the problem off? Or can we have a genuine arrangement which will ensure lasting peace in Ukraine? I am sorry, I'm not optimistic at this point in time at all. Because for whatever reason, so far, the United States has not pressurized Russia to come to the table and agree on 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or else. There's talk of or else, but no signs of any action being taken in that regard. Mr. Putin is playing a difficult hand, but he has a strong ally behind him, and that is China. So I think it's difficult to visualize at this point in time what the ultimate arrangement with Ukraine will be. I suspect it will be a messy arrangement. There are reports confirmed by President Trump himself that next week they will sign this rare earth agreement with the Ukrainians.
Indeed, yes.
Now, if the intention is for the Russians to be prevented from coming into Ukraine because there are American people on the ground, I think that is not going to be deterrent enough if Russia is determined enough. So, as I said, I'm not optimistic at this point in time, but I do believe that we will have some kind of arrangement sooner rather than later. And it will have to be seen who comes up as the winner in this process. Will it be an even balance? And I'm deliberately using the word Europe versus Russia, not Ukraine versus Russia. Will there be an even balance between Europe and Russia, or an uneven balance in favor of Russia? If there's an even balance between Europe and Russia, I think the signs may be hopeful going forward. Otherwise not. I'm sorry, I can't be more optimistic than that.
Well, in fact, that seems to be indicated by the outcomes of the meeting in Paris yesterday, because the latest reports are that Secretary Rubio has laid down the markers as far as the US is concerned now, telling all sides, which is Europe, Ukraine, and Russia, that this deal needs to be done. and has given some pointers regarding what the deal may entail, but those have not yet been specified. And there is an expectation that this timeline is going to be sooner rather than later, or the US may well walk away from the process. Let me ask you, since we are still on Europe, let me ask you a couple of issues which are difficult issues for Europe, frankly. The first one is there was a little bit of hesitancy and delay in Europe coming on board with the very idea of peace and whether there should be peace. And I think some argue that Europe is still looking for the strategic defeat of Russia before peace can be actually achieved. And this has very major long-term implications, because what would be the long-term impact of European policies which are anchored on permanent hostility towards Russia, and vice versa, Russia towards Europe? This is a conundrum which is extremely difficult to predict and very sensitively poised.
Yeah, I think look, if you're a European and if you take into account the manner in which Russia has been behaving vis-a-vis Europe in the last few years, they would want to inflict a strategic defeat on Russia. I mean, if I was sitting in Paris or Berlin or wherever, I would have sympathy for that approach.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the point
But
is...
using Ukraine as a proxy?
Yeah, of course.
Or directly engaging in the conflict?
Look, Ukraine has been the proxy for a while. Unfortunately, in my way of thinking, Ukraine has allowed itself to be used.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that's history. I may be wrong, but I mean, I'm sure the Ukrainians will say I'm completely wrong, but that's fine. It's a perspective. The problem, I think, so far has been that, as I mentioned earlier, the Europeans have been acting as partners in NATO and have been following policies which are basically driven by the United States.
Mm-hmm.
I think they have now begun to understand that they have to deal with Russia on themselves also. Now, as of now, if I were a European leader, for me, Russia is a strategic threat. And if I can strategically defeat it, well, defeat is a strong word, if I can keep it, diminish its strategic powers and authority, so be it. After all, look, if you were a Baltic state, or if you're Poland, you would want Russia to be defeated. Their history is such that they don't want to be incorporated or come under Russian influence again. After all, look, whatever else maybe the weaknesses of NATO, what Mr. Trump has done, the fact is Finland and Spain and Sweden, which stayed out of NATO since its inception, have joined. So there is a fear of Russia in Europe, and I think if Russia does not take steps to assuage European concerns about its future policies and actions vis-a-vis Europe, Europeans will still want to keep Russia at bay, and for that they will need to take steps that they feel necessary. As I said earlier, they have started taking those steps. It does not, however, mean that the Europeans will not deal with Russia. I think the linkage, the historical and civilizational linkages between, and more important, the economic and technological linkages,
Which are generally denied.
Are so important that I think, if we both lived in Southern Europe,
Yes.
we know that is the case.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, after all, where is all the Russian money invested? It's in the UK, and the UK and Russia have lousy relationships.
Mm-hmm.
It's in Austria. It's all over Europe. So it's in Cyprus. So I think there is a reality of the economic and civilizational and social realities, and there is the strategic threat, and the strategic threat has not gone away.
But that is true. I entirely agree.
Let me ask one more.
Yeah.
I think
Sure.
if I was sitting in a European capital, the question I would be asking is, if Ukraine loses, what will Russia do?
Expand more.
Exactly. So they had to be prepared for that.
Mm-hmm. All right, but from the realist perspective, let me just say that strategic defeat and regime change in Moscow, which involves really taking down a great power, is that feasible? Is it a realistic presumption? Does Europe really have the power to do that?
I think the European approach would be different. I think they are more interested in a regime in Moscow which is genuinely democratic.
Mm-hmm.
As I said, in my own view, the Europeans want to deal with Russia. They want to live with Russia.
But they deal with China all the time.
Exactly. But, but I think China is
it's not a democracy issue.
Yeah, the difference is that China does not propose any territorial threat to the Europeans, and there's no history of Soviet or Russian occupation of parts of what is today Europe, etc. So it's a bit complicated in that sense.
Mm-hmm.
But I think if the Europeans have a genuinely pluralistic democratic regime in Moscow, it would make life so much easier for them. I don't forget, I mean, since the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union was dissolved, relations between Europe and Russia were pretty good for a long time. And they were mutually beneficial. Seriously mutually beneficial. Europe has grown on cheap Russian energy.
So it takes two to tango, right?
It takes two to tango, exactly. But I think there is genuine fear, and frankly, if you are a European with good reason, at Russia's territorial designs on parts of Europe. Europe is also at fault. I'm not saying that. We'll come to that. But I think you had mentioned you want to discuss NATO also.
Yes, we're coming to that.
I think it's a very. That's why I said we are at the cusp of such major change, and we do not know where this will all go. And this uncertainty is bad for everything. It's bad for peace. It's bad for security. It's bad for development, and it's the worst for countries like ours.
Yes.
And that is why I think the initiative that we took to get the global south together is so critical, and it's important that that initiative and that process is sustained. The global south is not as weak as people think it is. If you actually put the strength of the global south together, exclude China and India.
Yeah.
Even if you exclude China and India, it's still a very strong. It can be a very strong group of countries given their resource bases, their technological and market bases, etc. So I think it's not something that can be written off. And that is why even though the West does not like it, they're being forced to at least accept the term Global South.
Yes, I mean the constant refrain is rather disparaging that you are not cohesive. Where is this Global South? But it doesn't take away from the fact that it is the bulk of the quote-unquote international community.
Yes.
So, all right. So this last question on Europe, which is equally a vexing one. So after the end of the Cold War, what do you think has been the role of NATO and of NATO expansion in relation to the current impasse? Because as I see it, and we both served in Europe, and we've seen NATO involvement in the Balkans, which is in Europe itself as a offensive force. We've seen NATO involvement outside the region, including close to us in Afghanistan, and aspects of NATO nations taking part in various types of operations from Libya to Syria to Iraq to elsewhere. And now there is even some kind of talk which people bring up, that there's a lot of interest in NATO in the Indo-Pacific. But let's stick with Europe for the time being. Let's keep it on that side. What is NATO's role at the moment? Does this permanent hostility towards Russia become a necessary condition for NATO's continuance and for NATO's survival?
Yeah, well, this is a fundamental question, isn't it? And my point is, if history had actually ended, why was NATO needed? So, contrary to what some very senior Western scholars have argued, history never ended, and history doesn't end. And I think, to my mind, retaining NATO was like a red rag to the bull.
Mhm.
When the Warsaw Pact was dissolved, if my memory serves me right, actually President Yeltsin actually he showed interest in membership of NATO, but was obviously rebuffed. The Russians were included as a G8 member for a time being, but that was the only gesture made to them.
Mhm.
But the continuation of NATO, to my mind, is a constant reminder to Russia of its permanently reduced status, notwithstanding its military strength, resources, and technological achievements. And the steady expansion of NATO to the borders of Russia was like the proverbial last straw. And now you may not agree, and I certainly don't agree with a lot of what he's done, with what President Putin has done, but there is no question in anybody's mind that he has constantly and for a long time reminded the West and NATO of the implications of the constant expansion of NATO towards Russia's borders, and it's that this was unacceptable to Russia. So I think the only answer I can give you is that the decision to keep expanding NATO and the decision to ignore Mr. Putin's warnings was either a conscious policy or a big error of judgment. You can take your pick. My own leaning is towards suggesting that it was part of a policy of dealing with Russia and using Russia to the extent that you can to your benefit, but ensuring that it never forgets that it is no longer the superpower that it was when the Cold War ended.
So it continues to drive a certain degree of angst in within Russia about about how the post-Cold War scenarios have evolved. I just wanted, just for the sake of remembering a few facts from our experiences in Europe, and people say that Russia has invaded Ukraine and it's been a terrible act of violation of sovereignty and of the UN Charter, which is obvious, which is true. But we can't forget that NATO itself has been responsible for the breakup of Serbia and the creation of Kosovo, which India still does not recognize as a country, and many countries don't recognize Kosovo. So the direct implication of a so-called defensive alliance in offensive operations in the Balkans is not a part of distant history. It's pretty recent in terms of our memory. Is there anything further on this issue you'd like to add, or shall we move forward with the other issues?
No, my only concern is that if this hostility towards Russia gets ingrained, you might have a new Iron Curtain in Europe.
Well, I mean, that would be terrible for civilization as a whole.
Exactly. I think that is something which the Europeans will want to avoid. I think.
So hopefully,
but again, it's a house divided, as you know.
Yeah. Hopefully, some better sense will come around and prevail, and there will be some opening between Europe and Russia, and hopefully this pressure from the United States to do some ceasefire and long-term peace in Ukraine might be a trigger for thinking or fresh thinking in that regard.
I think it's in everybody's interest that peace is restored on the European continent, and that is why I think the importance of the line taken by our government from day one, that this is not the time for war. I know it sounds like repeating a well-played record, but I think it's worth replaying this record, because the only country really which has been focusing on this issue and talking to both sides has been India, and saying this is not the time for war.
Yeah, exactly. But not only that, but talking to both sides and advising both sides. One side, this is not a time for war, and the other side, that you want to make peace, you need to talk to your adversary.
Exactly. You
So
do it to somebody else.
can't do it any other way.
Exactly. Yeah.
Excellent. Okay, so let me move on now to the United States and Russia, and we've just mentioned that peace in Europe and relative normalcy in ties between the U.S. and Russia will unquestionably have a stabilizing impact on world order. How do you see matters evolving between the United States and Russia beyond the Ukraine issue? And I have in mind here what has been hinted at but not very clearly specified in terms of the two powers working together on regional stability issues, on economic resources, and especially the more critical resources needed by the globe, and finally on arms control and strategic stability. So you see some opening there. You see progress because at least in terms of laying the groundwork for resuming more normal diplomatic relations is concerned, the two sides seem to be pretty advanced in their talks.
I'm actually quite impressed by the strategic patience Trump 2.0 has shown towards Russia in the last few weeks since they came to power. Now, after announcing that there'll be a ceasefire in 24 hours, etc., whatever.
Yeah.
I think the problem is even bringing about a ceasefire in Ukraine is not going to be easy.
Yes.
Ceasefire, even a long-term ceasefire, does not mean that the problems have gone away. So the question has to be answered: what does the United States want out of Russia? I think the issues which you mentioned are the important ones. You want strategic stability, you want to ensure nuclear deterrence, you want to ensure arms controls, etc. You want to try and ensure that there is a peaceful environment in which we all can develop. Now the problem is, and I mentioned this earlier, the extent of sanctions imposed on Russia and the penalties on individuals, including the President of the Russian Federation, in terms of ICJ and ICC, etc., and his core team, is not something that can just be wished away. So if Russia, I'm sure Russia wants peace. I mean, I think, I personally believe that Russia is paying a very heavy price for the Ukraine war. Yes, they've sustained the war effort, etc. We can all explain why, but it does not mean that a price is not being paid. So I think Russia would like a dignified way of extricating itself from the Ukraine war. So can the negotiators, particularly Americans, offer enough to the Russian side to make this dignified exit look like something that the regime can, or Mr. Putin can show as a victory to his own people? There will have to be one loser here. And I think that is where the critical choice will come. Will it be Ukraine or will it be Russia? The current state of play would suggest that the United States will favor the dice being weighed in favor of Russia, because Russia is still a military superpower. It is potentially still an economic and technological superpower. So I think that reality is not lost on Washington, not lost on Beijing, not lost on Brussels or any other European capital, or in Delhi for that matter. So Russia knows where its strengths are, but will it get the deal that offers it a face-saving exit? If that happens, then the likelihood of a US-Russia relationship getting stronger or getting normalized first, I think is something which will happen. it seems to me that the United States, as of now, at this point in time, is determined to bring an element of normalcy back into the Russia-US relationship. To what extent the Moscow can use this to its advantage is not simply a question of negotiating skill, frankly. It's a question of what the West can give up without losing face either. So in a very difficult situation, and hopefully cooler heads will weigh in and ensure that we can settle this as soon as possible, but it's not going to be easy. But signals as of now, to my mind, are clear that the United States wants to improve the relationship with Russia for whatever purposes, and I think we can talk about that a little later. That again will have implications for global security and stability and for the world economy.
But it'll be a better world if they manage to.
Yeah, it will be better.
Well, that's an important issue at the moment because President Trump has invested a lot of political capital in overcoming the fairly deep-rooted hostility towards Moscow in the United States to keep pushing this envelope of restoring some normalcy to this relationship and talking about it in a broader global environment where there is more stability, more peace, and less conflict in the world. Let's hope
There's
that.
one last point here. I think you and I have discussed this several times before, and we've written about it also. I think one of the reasons why the United States is taking the line that it is taking. I'm not here to defend whatever they are doing, but I think as an analyst, I feel that the United States cannot continue to control Eurasia without a good working relationship with Russia. And for US dominance of the world to continue, it needs Eurasia.
So this is not really a reverse Kissinger. It's a part reverse Kissinger.
Yeah, I mean, look, the reverse Kissinger side may come into play at a later point in time, but you have a third party here, which is also a very clever third party.
Mm-hmm.
That's why I said earlier in one of my interventions that do not rule out a Russia, China, US trilateral. I mean, look, let's give the Chinese credit for not just being a very big and powerful, important country. They're also a very skillful country, a very old civilization. They know how to play their cards. They have not closed their doors to the United States, even on tariff issues. They just said, treat us with dignity and equal, we'll talk.
Even yesterday, Mr. Trump was talking about a deal with China.
So I think that's why I say but I think the bottom line for me is that Eurasia continues to be very important for the United States.
Mm-hmm.
So you have Eurasia, and you really can't do too much in the Indo-Pacific unless you have Russia and China on board also, frankly, in the bottom line situation.
Okay, good. That's a. Yeah, let's hope that there is going to be greater normalcy in that relationship between the United States and Russia going forward. Turning to my next question, and the one part of the world where there's great angst about the passing moment of the liberal hegemony of the collective West. The angst is most deeply felt, obviously, in Europe and in Japan, but maybe among some other allies as well. But the reality is that this hegemony was always under challenge, already under major challenge, and is receding even in terms of the power balances which are emerging. Multipolarity is gaining some traction. It's something which is even recognized in the West, in Western circles. In this scenario, India is keeping all its options open. It's preserving its interests. It's maintaining its strategic independence. How do you think we are placed in terms of balancing our strategic partnerships?
Yeah, we had to come back home because I think that's what's most important.
Yeah.
No, I think we've done reasonably well so far. It's been a difficult hand of cards that's been played to us.
Yes.
And initially, when these major changes happened, particularly after Ukraine war, we were pilloried to a large extent by elements in the West. But I think we've explained, and our positions have gained traction. So I would say we have done reasonably well. But, and I think there's always a but, the challenges we are facing, I think, are really very significant. The good thing is, I think we have understood those challenges and are managing them well. And I think we have no option but to strengthen and leverage partnerships with the United States, with Russia and Europe, and of course the global South. With China, the Galwan episode led to a situation where the very painfully built up trust between the two countries over 20 plus years was destroyed. And but we have to keep our dialogue open with Chinese. As long as we can ensure that the normalizations processes that we are going to undertake are subject to strict mutuality of benefit, and there is no implication for our territorial integrity. So you'll notice that you had several dialogues in the last few weeks at reasonably high levels, EM, NSA, etc., Foreign Secretary. But we are moving very slowly, very
Yes.
carefully.
Very deliberate process.
And I think that's important. But at the same time, we must continue to pursue with economic and security heft, and I use security heft here very consciously, on our relationship with our neighbors, with Southeast Asia and West Asia. Mobilization and support to the global South will have to be sustained. And critically, strong domestic economic growth has to be sustained. Because unless we can do that, I think our ability to finance our security heft and our economic heft in our region will become a problem.
I don't want to bring in an element which we will probably discuss in future episodes, but at the moment it's of considerable concern to us that with the escalating tariff war between the United States and China, we are a major market and a open economy, and we might be targeted by an influx of cheap Chinese goods and steel and all sorts of Chinese products. So I think we cannot let our guard down at this time. As you say, we must maintain a very deliberate step-by-step process, safeguarding all our interests, our economic interests, our territorial interests, in moving purposefully, meaningfully, but at the same time very cautiously in this normalization process with China. Would you agree?
Yeah, I didn't bring in the trade diversion aspect in
No, yes.
response to you earlier for the simple reason that I think this is one area where the government is doing reasonably well.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the important thing is we are negotiating this trade agreement with the EU, with the United States, and we will obviously be talking to ASEAN also.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I think the important thing here is that this trade diversion aspect has to be covered with all these countries, not just bilaterally with the Chinese, because after all we have a free trade arrangement with ASEAN also.
Mm-hmm.
We've had a lot of ingress of Chinese products through ASEAN sources also. So there are areas which I think are being very carefully monitored by government authorities and by the associations.
Yes.
So I think there they've learned the lesson. At the same time, there is obviously pressure on the government to allow some kinds of Chinese investment or import of Chinese components, etc., to ensure that the industry keeps growing, because we have created the dependencies, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm.
And it will take time to overcome those dependencies. So I think there is a tightrope which is being walked. So far, I think it's being walked well, but the danger of trade diversion, I think, is you brought out, is extremely relevant. But I also believe that this is the government is very conscious of this. I've been hearing this at highest levels. We both read in the papers also. I think the ministries are quite careful about how this is going to be handled.
This is an aspect, incidentally, I mean, this is not something which we need to discuss at the moment, but even in the United States approach towards negotiating the trade deals with countries, the aspect of how to deal with China in a manner that you do not have these diversion issues come forward is also very relevant in that context. Okay, so now let's turn to the Indo-Pacific, which is still, I mean, we are coming closer and closer to home. You have the wars in Europe and in the Middle East, which preoccupy the United States and take its focus away yet one more time from Asia and the Indo-Pacific. Everybody knows and understands that it is this region which is more than likely to determine the future of world order. Its importance has grown, its geopolitical and geoeconomic importance is recognized. Do you think that the US pivot to the Indo-Pacific will finally arrive at some stage, maybe in the coming 2 or 3 years, or will the burden of regional security issues, regional stability issues continue to fall even more strongly on regional powers, including India? Or maybe it's going to be both. So the United States will be there, but it will also be pressing its regional partners to do more.
I think we're going to see a mix of both. But let me first address the basic point you raised. And again, just like Eurasia is important for the United States, in my way of thinking, if the United States wishes to remain the most dominant power in the world, it has no option but to meaningfully sustain its pivot to the Indo-Pacific.
Mm-hmm.
Now, obviously, it may not be happening as quickly as we would like it to happen. And there seems to be some kind of a jinx on this. As you know, the Indo-Pacific process started under Donald Rumsfeld when he was Secretary of Defense. So it's taken a while, but I think the consciousness in the US security establishment and the US foreign policy establishment of the importance of the Indo-Pacific not lost. And part of the reason is that the power balances are shifting from the Euro-Atlantic to the Indo-Pacific. So
Yes.
It's not as if the Indo-Pacific is going to replace the Euro-Atlantic. It may at some point, but right now it's a question of secular regulative shift from the Euro-Atlantic to the Indo-Pacific. At the same time, I think countries, you cannot depend, and it's not because of what's happening now.
Mm-hmm.
I think it is unfair to expect that the United States will defend the whole of the Indo-Pacific.
True.
I think at the same time, countries of the region, and I think especially India, because I think the Japan at one end and India at the other end have been important in bringing this whole process of Indo-Pacific out into the open and making it more meaningful and relevant to the whole world. I think countries of the region like India must bear, for want of a better word, a fair share of the burden of providing security in the region. For India, the focus will have to be the Indian Ocean, while collaborating with other partners in the Pacific. This is already happening. More has to happen. But not only more will have to happen, this whole process will have to be systematically strengthened. And this, to my way of thinking, apart from collaborating with other navies in a more meaningful manner, not just parsec exercises, etc., I think will require 2 or 3 things. First is that our naval strength has to keep growing. It's growing, but maybe not fast enough, and we need that to happen sooner rather than later. And let me say something which you and I have discussed, and I have been saying to you for a while. India has to substantially enhance its nuclear arsenal and its
Triad.
and its delivery capabilities and its triad. I think it would be foolish and strategically incompetent for not to do this when your biggest challenge in the region, with whom you have a long unsettled border, is consciously and openly adding to its nuclear weapon strength and is adding to its missile and delivery capability literally on a daily basis. So I think we have notice being given to us. So we have to take a fair share of the burden, I think. And there are others in the Pacific part who will have to take their share. And I think we cannot afford the luxury of not taking on more responsibilities, especially in the Indian Ocean region and so far as the Indo-Pacific is concerned. And this is over and above the problems we have with the land borders.
Yes, certainly.
Along-
Which don't go away.
Which are not going to go away for a while.
Yeah.
So, and the new addition, of course, is Bangladesh.
Which will be the subject of one of our future discussions. But yes, indeed, I would just say that one good sign is that in the meeting between President Trump and Prime Minister Modi in February, among the agreements which were reached, which related to defense cooperation, two issues. One is operational sustainability across the Indo-Pacific and helping each other with that aspect, which really involves not just logistics, it involves so many other things, repair facilities, MROs, things of that kind. And also the question of doing more with each other in the Western Indian Ocean, which is for a long time, it's been one of the things on India's mind.
I think it's also important. I talked about more partnerships with the Pacific countries, and I would specifically, we are already doing it. I think with Vietnam and with now Philippines and maybe Malaysia to some extent. I think we need to do it more and more with our ASEAN partners. I do not know how much we can do with Japan, but I think with the ASEAN partners we can do much more.
There is some talk in ASEAN, in fact, since you raised this issue, that in the current situation where there's even greater uncertainty more than ever before, they need to be much more clear on what ASEAN centrality means in the context of both traditional and non-traditional security. So hopefully we will have a little bit of an opening there.
Yeah.
And so coming to our last point of discussion on this episode, and maybe we should end on a very positive note because there have been some very good developments closer to home. And I think past few weeks have seen very significant advances in India's relations, taking forward the BIMSTEC idea. Actually, the process of setting up the rules of procedure to implement the BIMSTEC Charter have now been established so that this regional cooperation body can do much more. Everything is on the cards, which is pretty good, except there is no reference yet of any trade bloc. Then there is an enhanced partnership with Thailand. It's a country which is an immediate neighbor. It's important for our connectivity programs across Myanmar to Southeast Asia. There is also a consolidation of relations with Sri Lanka. It's remarkable that people don't remember that when Sri Lanka was in dire distress, it was India which came forward with $4 billion worth of assistance. And even on this trip of the Prime Minister, we've forgiven $100 million worth of loans made to Sri Lanka. We've reduced the interest rates on other outstandings. And there's been significant progress there. And finally, last month, you remember that you had covered that in one of your pieces, which is the visit to Mauritius and upgrading of our engagement with that Indian Ocean neighbor and important partner, and also scaling up the Sagar initiative into Mahasagar. And you can see that there are already the impact of Mahasagar is already relevant because we're doing more with the navies of Tanzania, Kenya, Mozambique, the entire region. We are much more engaged across this part of the world. So this is my penultimate question to you. There's one more coming, but this is the penultimate.
Yeah, I think I partly answered this question already because I think we're doing quite well in our neighborhood, also in our extended hinterland. I think in our experience, the only place sometimes where we fall short is the timely implementation of agreements entered into. That has changed, is changing. I think needs to change much more. Our delivery has to be much faster than it is even now. That is one point I want to make. The other point I want to make is, there will be always malign players wanting to interfere in our neighborhood. It's been true since our independence. Now, if you're a small neighbor, you will obviously play off two big parts. It's also part of Chanakya Niti. But I think we have demonstrated over the years that no matter how serious the effort to undermine our relations with our neighbors, we have the basic strength in these relationships from the grassroots upwards to enable us to substantially neutralize those negative influences. And as we have become more able, because of our economic growth and our technological growth, to be able to share more of what we have, I think our ability to match those who want to undermine our influence has also grown. I've for long believed that we have the ability to ensure that India remains the dominant player in South Asia. We have to put in place some of the means to ensure that that happens on a sustained basis. I think our intelligence gathering has to be improved to ensure that happens. Our economic interaction has to grow even more. BIMSTEC is one such effort. I think our neighbors are already benefiting enormously from the Indian market and from the Indian economy. And as this mutuality of benefit becomes obvious to the average consumer on the ground in this country, I think our position will get stronger. And the fact that we have now for many years been the first responders in every crisis in these countries, I think speaks for itself. So you will obviously have political elements in these countries and other outside powers wanting to neutralize India's efforts and India's influence in this country. But I think as long as we are confident in our abilities and handle our neighbors well, I think we will be able to retain the upper hand. And where we have to claw back, we'll claw back with patience and with work on the ground. There is no need to show any stick. It does not help.
Yes.
We are both served in neighboring countries, and we know that. I think persuasion and actual work on the ground is what counts for much more, and your credibility is what counts most. And I think we are becoming a much more credible partner, not just in our immediate South Asian neighborhood, but in West Asia, in Southeast Asia, in Africa, and gradually even in Latin America, but to a much lesser extent.
Very good. So let me say also that in our own immediate neighborhood, we were once again the first providers of humanitarian assistance following the massive earthquake in central Myanmar. And this is something which is not lost on various countries, including our partners, including our Quad partners who issued a joint statement on the tragedy which occurred and the need for humanitarian assistance flows to be ensured. But India has done more than that. India has actually delivered with boots on the ground and with hospitals on the ground, more than boots.
And at amazing speed.
And at amazing speed, within 24 hours, we had teams on the ground with search and rescue, with medical assistance, with humanitarian supplies. And it was a joint effort. It was by air and by sea. So I think we need to note that, because that's an aspect which has now become very clear to nations in our region, in Southeast Asia, in Africa. And this is a role which role of net security provision, which India is providing to all nations of our extended neighborhood. So that's something which we should welcome.
Oh, absolutely. But I think I would say that we also look upon this as our duty. I think this is something which our neighbors have begun to understand. The only point I'd like to make about Myanmar is that I hope that we sustain our efforts in Myanmar now once the rehabilitation processes also begin.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm hoping that we can be part of a process that will ensure that there is return to normalcy and democracy in Myanmar. It's in everybody's interest, certainly India's interest. So maybe the only thought I'd like to put to you is that little more proactive diplomacy with Myanmar, and this unfortunate tragedy might be the way of trying to offer a process by which we can help get the parties together and restore democracy in Myanmar.
Well, we are making consistently, we are making strides towards being an increasingly important factor for stability, for development, for progress, and certainly, as you note, as we devote more attention to implementation, this role is only going to continue to grow. Thank you, Nalin. I think that concludes this episode. Thank you very much for joining me, and we'll see our audience and our viewers at our next session. Thank you very much. Thank you.